My son, Mark, was my world, the anchor that kept me steady in the quiet sea of my life. After my husband, Robert, passed away 5 years ago, Mark became the sole focus of my love, the living, breathing embodiment of the best parts of the man I had adored for 40 years. Robert had been a man of quiet integrity and immense gentle strength. He worked as a master carpenter, and our home, the one he built with his own 2 hands, was his testament. It was a house that smelled perpetually of pine sawdust and lemon oil, a place filled with the warmth of his hand-carved furniture. I could still trace the grain on the mantelpiece he'd salvaged from an old barn, my fingers finding the familiar dips and whirls he'd so lovingly sanded smooth. He left me financially secure, not wealthy in the way of stocks and sprawling mansions, but comfortable. The house was paid for, and there was a nest egg he diligently, almost religiously, saved. "For a rainy day, Eleanor," he'd always said with a wink, patting my hand, "or for a day that needs a little sunshine." That money wasn't just currency. It was his foresight, his final act of taking care of me. When Mark first introduced me to Tiffany, I did what any mother would do. I tried to see what he saw. On the surface, it was obvious. She was undeniably beautiful, a polished artifact from a world I only saw in magazines. She had a sleek, razor-sharp blonde haircut that must have cost a fortune to maintain, and her nails were always immaculate, painted in bold, fashionable colors. But her eyes, a pale, chilly blue, were hard. They were constantly scanning, assessing the value of everything and everyone around her. When she first walked into my home, she'd offered a tight smile and complimented it by calling it charming and so rustic, the way one might describe a cabin they'd never actually want to sleep in. I watched her gaze slide over the solid oak dining table Robert had built, the one where we'd shared thousands of meals and where Mark had done his homework as a boy. I could almost see the mental calculator in her eyes, tallying up how much the quaint piece might fetch at a flea market before being replaced by something glass and chrome. For Mark's sake, I held my tongue. He was utterly smitten, blinded by her glamour and the sophisticated, fast-paced world she seemed to represent. Mark worked a respectable but modest job as a graphic designer, and I could see the subtle strain on his face as he tried to keep up with her voracious appetite for 5-star restaurants, designer labels, and spontaneous weekend getaways. I worried, but a mother's worry is often a silent, heavy cloak you learn to wear. To voice it is to risk being called meddling, or worse, jealous. The day they announced their engagement, my heart swelled with a complicated, painful mix of joy and apprehension. I hugged my son tightly, burying my face in his shoulder and inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne, a scent that for a moment made him my little boy again. "I'm so happy for you, my darling," I whispered, and I meant it. His happiness was paramount, but over his shoulder I saw Tiffany's smile. It was a victor's smile, and it didn't come close to reaching her cold eyes. She was already looking past us, her gaze fixed on a future that I suspected had a very specific, very high price tag. "We're going to have the wedding of the year, Eleanor," she announced, her voice dripping with an ambition that sounded more like a threat than a promise. "Something people will talk about for a very, very long time." I managed a smile back, a knot of pure dread tightening in my stomach. I had a feeling she was right, but perhaps not for the reasons she imagined. My only wish was for Mark's happiness, a day of pure sunshine he so deserved. I just prayed the cost wouldn't be more than he, or I, could possibly bear. The wedding planning began almost immediately, though planning suggests a collaboration that never existed. It was, instead, a series of royal decrees issued by Tiffany, who seemed to believe she was orchestrating a state coronation. She had binders, thick and heavy, filled with glossy clippings from celebrity wedding magazines. Her long manicured fingers would trace over photos of floral arrangements that cost more than my car, and she'd sigh dramatically about the importance of getting the aesthetic just right. The venue she had set her heart on was the Willow Creek Estate, a sprawling Gatsby-esque mansion with acres of manicured gardens, a fleet of white-gloved staff, and a crystal chandeliered ballroom that could hold 300 guests. It was the kind of place you see in movies, a fantasy of wealth and status. When Mark, his face pale, gently tried to show her the price list for such a place, she'd waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. Don't be so provincial, Mark. You can't put a price on perfection. These are the memories that last a lifetime. We'll figure it out. Figuring it out fell squarely on my son's shoulders. I watched him grow more and more stressed, the easygoing light in his eyes dimming with each spreadsheet he reviewed. He started working late every night, taking on extra freelance projects that left him exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. The joy of his engagement was being crushed under the weight of Tiffany's expectations. One evening, he called me, his voice so heavy with defeat, it was barely a whisper. Mom, I don't know how we're going to do this. The deposit for Willow Creek alone it's astronomical. It's more than I make in 6 months. Tiffany will be absolutely heartbroken if we have to settle for the community hall or that hotel ballroom downtown. She said it would be humiliating. Hearing the sheer despair in his voice was like a physical blow. All I had ever wanted was to see him happy, to see him stand tall and proud on the most important day of his life, not bent and broken by debt before it even began. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the quiet, dark house, my hand trailing over the furniture Robert had made. I stopped in front of his portrait on the mantelpiece, his kind eyes smiling at me. I thought about his words, spoken so many times they were etched into my heart. For a day that needs a little sunshine. This was it. This was the day. Mark deserved this one perfect, sun-drenched day. A day free from the suffocating cloud of financial worry. The next morning, my resolve was set. I dressed carefully, drove to the bank, and sat with the branch manager I'd known for 20 years. I asked him to draw up a cashier's check from my savings for a sum that made his eyebrows shoot up. My hands trembled as he handed it to me. It felt like letting go of my past, of 40 years of careful planning with Robert, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that he would have approved. It was for our son. I made an appointment with the events manager at the Willow Creek Estate, a polished, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Davison. Sitting in his plush leather chair, with the check safely in my purse, I felt a strange sense of power. I'd like to pay for the royal package for the wedding of Mark Peterson and Tiffany Bell, I said, my voice clear and steady. The whole thing. The catering, the premium open bar, the string quartet for the ceremony, the 10-piece band for the reception, all of it. Mr. Davison's professional composure cracked for a moment. All of it. Ma'am, that is an incredibly generous, a truly magnificent gesture. There's one condition, I interrupted gently, meeting his gaze. It must be completely and utterly anonymous. As far as the bride and groom are concerned, the venue is giving them a special promotional discount, a very, very deep discount, perhaps for being such a photogenic couple. They can never know the source of the funds. Can I have your word on that, Mr. Davison? He looked at me, a flicker of deep understanding in his professional eyes, and nodded slowly. Of course, Mrs. Peterson. Your secret is absolutely safe with us. I signed the contract, paid in full, and left with a simple receipt tucked deep in my purse and a feeling of quiet, profound, and secret love for my son. This was my gift to him, an act of love, pure and simple. In the weeks that followed, my secret gift seemed to have worked its magic. A tangible lightness returned to Mark's spirit. The stress vanished from his face, replaced by a relieved, boyish excitement I hadn't seen in months. He'd call me just to talk about how smoothly everything was going, his voice full of genuine joy. Tiffany, meanwhile, was ecstatic, preening about her incredible negotiating skills to anyone who would listen. "You see, Mark? I told you it would work out." I overheard her gloating to him on the phone one afternoon when they'd stopped by. "These high-end places are intimidated by people who know what they want. They just needed to see that I was a bride with impeccable standards. They're practically giving us the place just for the publicity." I would just smile from the kitchen and say how wonderful that was, the bitter irony a secret I held close. My anonymity, however, came at a cost I hadn't anticipated. Now that the financial leverage was gone, now that I was no longer a potential source of funds, Tiffany's thinly veiled disdain for me became overt and cruel. I was systematically and very deliberately excluded from the joyful rites of a mother of the groom. When she went shopping for her wedding dress, she took her own mother and a gaggle of giggling friends. When I asked if I could join them, she'd given me a pitying look and said, "Oh, Eleanor, it's really more of a modern, fashion-forward crowd. Your traditional taste just wouldn't fit the aesthetic we're going for. We'll show you pictures." I only saw the gown, a confection of imported lace and silk that cost a fortune, when she posted a triumphant photo of it on social media. Determined to play a part, I offered to host a small, intimate bridal shower for her. I invited the women from our side of the family, old friends who had known Mark since he was a boy, and who were eager to welcome his bride. I spent 2 days cooking and baking, filling the house with Robert's favorite recipes. Tiffany arrived an hour late, wrinkled her nose at the homemade quiche and pastries, and spent the entire time scrolling through her phone. She left after less than an hour, claiming she had a sudden, urgent fitting. The gift I gave her, a beautiful hand-carved jewelry box Robert had made from cherry wood, was left behind on the table, forgotten. Mark called later, his voice tinny with apology. "She's just so overwhelmed with all the planning, Mom. She didn't mean anything by it." The slights grew more pointed, like 1,000 tiny cuts. She critiqued the dress I had chosen for the wedding, a tasteful, elegant silk dress in a dusty blue, suggesting it was a little drab and that I should find something that would help me blend into the background more. The implication was clear. I, into the background, was a relic from a simpler, less sophisticated past that she was eager to erase. Through it all, Mark was a ghost, a silent accomplice to my erasure. He would wince at her sharper comments, offer a weak, placating smile in my direction, but he never once stood up to her. "Just try to get along, Mom," he'd plead with me in private. "It's such a stressful time for her. Let's just keep the peace until the wedding." Each excuse he made for her felt like a small, deliberate tear in the fabric of our relationship. I was losing my son, not to the love of another woman, but to his own profound weakness, his own inability to defend the mother who had given him everything. I would lie awake in my quiet house, the initial joy of my secret gift curdling into a slow-burning ache of regret. I had paid for her perfect day, and in return, she was trying to render me invisible, a background character in my own son's life. The price of his happiness, I was beginning to realize with chilling clarity, was my dignity. The wedding day arrived, a perfect sun-drenched Saturday in June that seemed torn from the pages of Tiffany's magazines. The Willow Creek estate was breathtaking, even more beautiful than I had imagined. Cascading arches of white roses and peonies framed the entrance. A string quartet played Vivaldi softly in the garden, and waiters in crisp white uniforms moved silently among the arriving guests, offering flutes of champagne. My heart ached with a bittersweet pride. This was it. The sunshine I had bought for my son. All this beauty, all this perfection was my secret. I wore my drab blue dress, but I'd added Robert's favorite pearl necklace and matching earrings, a silent armor of his love and my own self-worth. I felt elegant and, more importantly, I felt like myself. I found my seat at the very front, at the large circular table reserved for the immediate family, right next to the empty seat for the groom. My name, Eleanor Peterson, was written in beautiful calligraphy on the place card. I smiled at old friends and relatives who came by to congratulate me, feeling a fragile sense of belonging. For a moment, watching Mark at the altar, looking so impossibly handsome and happy, his eyes shining as Tiffany walked towards him, I thought it was all worth it. The slights, the insults, the casual cruelty, they all seemed to melt away in the face of my son's radiant joy. The ceremony was a blur of promises and applause. After they were pronounced husband and wife and shared their first kiss, the guests moved into the grand ballroom for the reception. I made my way back to the family table, my heart feeling lighter than it had in months. But when I reached my chair, my place card was gone. In its spot was a new one, bearing the name of Tiffany's great-aunt, a woman I'd never met. The woman was already sitting there, giving me a brief, sympathetic shrug as if to say, "What can you do?" I stood there, rooted to the spot in confusion, scanning the table, then the room, a cold dread seeping into my veins. That's when Tiffany glided over, a triumphant, malicious smirk on her face. She looked like a queen surveying her court. Mark trailed behind her like a well-trained dog, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet mine. "Eleanor," Tiffany said, her voice a little too loud, ensuring the whole table could hear. "There's been a little change of plans. We just had so many important people to seat at the head table, you understand. We needed the seat." She paused for effect before delivering the final blow. "But we've found a way for you to contribute." She gestured to a nearby service station, where a plain, starched white apron was draped over a chair. "You can help the catering staff pass out the champagne for the toast. It's important to feel useful after all, and this way you're still part of everything." A cold, heavy silence fell over our table. I looked from her smug, victorious face to my son's. I searched his eyes, desperately, for any sign of protest, any flicker of the loyal, good-hearted boy I had raised. I saw nothing but cowardice and shame. He wouldn't even meet my gaze. "Mark," I whispered, my voice so small it was barely audible. He just shuffled his feet on the plush carpet and muttered, "Tiffany thinks it's for the best, Mom. Let's not make a scene." That was the moment my heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million icy shards. She wasn't just removing me from the table. She was recasting my role in the entire story. I was no longer the mother of the groom. I was staff. She picked up the apron and held it out to me. "You're the help, not a guest," she said, her voice a cruel, triumphant whisper meant only for me. I looked at the stark white fabric in her hand, a symbol of my complete and utter humiliation. Then I looked back at her gleaming, merciless face, and I did something she never, in her wildest dreams, expected. I took the apron from her, and I smiled. It was a cold, brittle smile, one that didn't touch my eyes, but a smile nonetheless. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that I had bought and paid for every single laugh, every flower, every sip of champagne in this room. And she had no idea that I was about to collect the debt. I tied the crisp, white apron around the waist of my silk dress. The strings felt tight and binding, the knot a symbol of the final, unbreakable severing of a bond. My elegant dress was now a uniform. A wave of heat washed over my face, a blush of profound, soul-deep humiliation that I refused to let show in my expression. I could feel the eyes of the guests on me, 100 pairs of eyes. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed for me. Others, the ones from Tiffany's side of the room, whispered behind their manicured hands, their expressions a vulgar mixture of pity and amusement. I saw my cousin Sarah, a woman who had always been more like a sister to me, shoot me a horrified look from across the room, her mouth forming the silent words, "What are you doing?" I gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head, a signal to stay put, to trust me. My hands, which had been trembling with shock just moments before, were now perfectly steady. The initial white-hot pain had receded, replaced by a strange and terrible calm, a crystalline clarity of purpose. It was the calm of a general on a battlefield, surveying the devastating losses and planning the precise, decisive counter-assault. I walked to the service station and picked up a heavy silver tray laden with flutes of bubbling golden champagne. The physical weight of it was grounding, a tangible focus in a world that had just spun off its axis. For the next hour, a period of time that stretched into an eternity, I performed my assigned role with flawless, chilling precision. I moved through the lavishly decorated ballroom, the very picture of quiet, efficient servitude. "Champagne?" I would ask, my voice even, polite, and utterly devoid of emotion. I served Mark's college friends, young men I'd fed in my own kitchen, who now looked at me with open-mouthed confusion before taking a glass. I served Tiffany's parents, who had the gall to look straight through me, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation about their recent trip to Tuscany. I deliberately navigated my way to the head table. Tiffany watched my every move, a smug, satisfied look on her face. This was her ultimate triumph. She hadn't just married the son. She had successfully demoted and dominated the mother. She had put me firmly in my place, and Mark, my son, sat beside her, laughing at something one of his groomsmen said. He looked over at me once as I offered him a glass, a flicker of something, guilt, over at me once, discomfort, crossing his features before he quickly looked away, taking a glass without a word. He chose this. He chose her cruelty over my dignity. He was a stranger to me now, sitting in a suit I'd helped him pay for, in a room I had bought, celebrating a marriage built on a foundation of my abject humiliation. With each glass I served, the ice in my veins spread, hardening my resolve. I wasn't Eleanor Peterson, loving mother and grieving widow anymore. I was a silent observer, a ghost in an apron, gathering evidence for a final judgment. I was the secret benefactor, the anonymous source of all this splendor. And the feast, I decided with absolute finality, was about to come to a swift and brutal end. I set my now empty tray down on a service stand, my movements slow and deliberate. I had given them their hour of glory, an hour they had used to debase me. Now it was my turn. I reached behind my back, untied the apron, folded it into a neat, tight square, and placed it on the silver tray. My performance was over. The curtain was about to fall. With the apron laid to rest like a flag of surrender, though only I knew it was a declaration of war, I felt a profound weight lift from my shoulders. I straightened my spine, which had been unconsciously stooped in my role as a servant, and smoothed the front of my silk dress. I took a deep, steadying breath, the air in the opulent ballroom suddenly feeling thin and cold. My mission was singular and clear. I began to walk. My low heels made a soft, determined click-clack on the polished marble floor, a sound that seemed to cut through the din of the celebration, a metronome marking the final seconds of their perfect day. The ballroom was a swirling sea of noise and motion. The 10-piece band was playing a lively jazz number. People were laughing loudly, and the air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfume and thousands of wilting roses. I walked right through the middle of it all, an island of calm in the chaos, a woman on a singular, unswerving path. I passed tables of strangers who paid me no mind. I passed my own relatives, who watched my progress with worried, questioning eyes. their conversations faltering as I went by. I did not stop. I did not acknowledge them. My target was a discreetly marked door at the far end of the ballroom, estate manager. To reach it, my path took me directly past the head table. Tiffany was in the middle of a grand, theatrical story, her hands gesturing wildly as her bridesmaids roared with sycophantic laughter. She saw me approaching out of the corner of her eye, and her smile faltered for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. She probably thought I was coming to make a scene, to cry or plead or yell. I saw her subtly straighten her back, her chin lifting, bracing herself for a distasteful confrontation she was sure she would win. I didn't even glance at her. My gaze was fixed, laser-like, on Mark. As I passed, our eyes met for a long, silent, pregnant moment. In that instant, I let him see everything I was feeling. Not just the pain, but the depth of my hurt, the finality of my disappointment, and the cold, unyielding resolve that had taken its place. It was a look that said, "It's over." I saw a flash of raw panic in his eyes, a dawning, horrified realization that he had made a catastrophic, life-altering miscalculation. He started to rise from his chair, his mouth opening as if to say my name, to stop me. I gave him one final look. It was not a look of anger or of sadness. It was a look of pure, chilling dismissal. The kind of look you might give a stranger who has bumped into you on the street before you move on, forgetting them instantly. It stopped him cold. Before you move on, he sank back into his chair as if my gaze had been a physical blow, his face ashen. I turned away from him and the life I had known without breaking my stride. I had said my goodbye. I reached the manager's solid oak door, gave it 2 firm, decisive knocks, and entered without waiting for an invitation. Mr. Davison was at his desk reviewing some paperwork. He looked up, his professional smile ready, then saw my expression, and it vanished. "Mrs. Peterson," he began, his voice laced with concern, "is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect, Mr. Davison," I said, my voice as calm and clear as a frozen lake. I reached into my small evening bag, the one I had clutched all night, and pulled out the single folded piece of paper inside. The receipt, the proof of payment in full for this entire extravagant affair. I laid it flat on his polished desk between us. I believe we had an agreement, Mr. Davison stared at the receipt, a long document detailing every last expensive item of the royal package, from the ice sculptures to the premium champagne I had just been serving. Then his gaze lifted to my face. The professional mask slipped completely, revealing a man of decency who was genuinely appalled. "Mrs. Peterson, I saw what they did. Out there, with the apron. It's unconscionable. It's the most classless, cruel thing I've ever witnessed at an event here. If there's anything at all I can do." "There is," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his well-meaning sympathy. I didn't need his pity. I needed his contractual compliance. "You and I had an agreement, Mr. Davison, a gentleman's agreement backed by a very large sum of my money. The understanding was that my payment was an anonymous gift. A gift, by its very nature, is given out of love and is contingent upon a foundation of mutual respect. As you have just witnessed with your own eyes, those conditions are no longer being met. Therefore, the gift is rescinded." He looked utterly bewildered, shaking his head slightly. "Ma'am, I don't understand. The event is paid for. The contract is signed. I can't just give the money back in the middle of the party." "You misunderstand me," I clarified, leaning forward slightly, my hands resting on his desk. My voice was low, but each word was laced with steel. "I am not asking for a refund. The event that I, Eleanor Peterson, paid for is over. The party being hosted out there by Tiffany and Mark Peterson, however, has a rather significant outstanding balance. In fact, looking at your records, I believe you'll find they haven't paid a single dime towards it, have they? The legal and contractual distinction hit him like a physical shock. He was a businessman, first and foremost. His eyes widened as he grasped the beautiful, terrible simplicity of my logic. You want me to shut it down? Right now, he whispered, the color draining from his face. I want you to approach the hosts of this event and inform them that payment is due immediately, in full. If they are unable to provide it, then you must act according to your standard business policy for non-payment, I said, my gaze unwavering. I folded my hands on his desk, a gesture of finality. This is my son's wedding, Mr. Davison, and my heart is broken. But this is your establishment, and your reputation for not being taken advantage of is on the line. I am simply informing you, as the sole benefactor, that the funds have been withdrawn. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, the gears turning in his head. Then he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. A new kind of steel entered his own eyes. He was no longer dealing with a sentimental old woman. He was dealing with his client. As you wish, Mrs. Peterson. He stood up, all business, and walked out of his office with purpose. I followed a few paces behind, a silent observer to the final act I had set in motion. He went directly to the band leader and whispered a single sentence. The lively jazz music stuttered, screeched, and died in an abrupt, shocking halt. A moment later, a loud click echoed through the ballroom, and the romantic dimmed lighting was extinguished, replaced by the harsh, flat, unforgiving glare of the overhead utility lights. The entire room fell silent, the guests blinking in the sudden, unflattering brilliance like startled mice. Mr. Davison took the microphone from the stunned singer's hand. His amplified voice boomed through the silent hall, sharp and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? All 300 pairs of eyes were on him. Due to an unforeseen and insurmountable issue with the event's financing, we have a complete and immediate failure of payment for all services rendered this evening. The Willow Creek Estate is therefore terminating this event, effective immediately. I must ask you all to please gather your belongings and vacate the premises. A collective ragged gasp went through the room. Then, pandemonium. I watched as Tiffany's perfectly made-up face cycled through confusion, to disbelief, to pure, unadulterated horror. She turned to Mark, her mouth agape. What is he talking about? I negotiated the deal. It's all paid for. Mark was paper white, his panicked eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me, standing calmly by the manager's office door. In that instant, he knew exactly what I had done. The aftermath was a symphony of chaos and humiliation, played out under the merciless glare of the utility lights. The bewildered guests, murmuring amongst themselves in a rising tide of gossip, began to awkwardly gather their things. They cast confused and pitying glances towards the head table, which now looked less like a royal dais and more like the scene of a public shaming. The well-trained staff, acting on Mr. Davison's curt, whispered instructions, began to move with cold, impersonal efficiency. They cleared tables with a clatter of silverware and glass, whisking away the half-eaten entrees, the towering floral centerpieces, and the full glasses of champagne. The dream Tiffany had bought with my money and my humiliation was being dismantled, piece by piece, before her very eyes. She became hysterical, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. This is a mistake. You're ruining my wedding. It's all paid for, she shrieked at Mr. Davison, who simply stood his ground, arms crossed, with the impassive air of a man who held all the cards. My apologies, madam, he said, his voice cool and utterly final. But our records show no payment has been received from you or Mr. Peterson. The account is delinquent. Mark, his face pale and stricken, finally stumbled away from the wreckage of his head table and made his way over to me. He looked like a boy who had just been called into the principal's office. "Mom, how could you?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and anguish. I looked at my son, the boy I had loved so fiercely, the man he had failed to become, and I felt a profound and desolate sorrow that was deeper than anger. "How could I?" I repeated, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of every slight, every casual cruelty, every moment of disrespect. "I paid for this entire day, Mark, from the invitations to that last glass of champagne. It was my life savings, the money your father and I put away for 40 years. It was my wedding gift to you. All I asked for in return was to be treated with a little bit of love and dignity, to be seen as your mother, not as the help." I held his gaze, forcing him to see the truth. "When your wife handed me that apron, and you stood there and said nothing, you both made it very clear what my presence was worth to you. Said nothing, so I took my gift back." Tears of self-pity welled in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was scared of her. I didn't know what to do." "I know," I said, and that was the most heartbreaking part of it all. It wasn't malice on his part, but a deep and abiding weakness I could no longer enable or excuse. "You let her humiliate me to keep your peace. You made your choice. Now you can live with the consequences of that choice." Tiffany, having overheard our exchange, stomped over, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure rage. You old witch, you did this on purpose. You were jealous. You did this to ruin my perfect day." I didn't even honor her with a response. She was nothing to me now. I simply turned my back on her shrill accusations and on my son's pathetic weeping form. I walked through the stream of departing guests, my head held high. I could hear their voices fading behind me, her rage and his apologies becoming just so much meaningless noise. I pushed open the grand doors of the Willow Creek estate and stepped out into the cool, quiet night air. The sun had set long ago. The day I had paid for was over. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed myself. And as I walked to my car, alone under the silent stars, I felt the satisfying, solid weight of my own dignity settling back onto my shoulders where it belonged. It was, I thought, a fair trade